Automating away the awful here on Machine Learning Basics. Hey folks, it's Blake. Sorry it's been too long. I've been out sick actually. So while I've been too sick to produce a video without being disgusting, I have been able to keep coding. So I'm going to be doing a few videos back to back. Topic we're going to be covering is automating the machine learning process. There are some parts of the Unity ML toolset that I really like, and there are some other parts that were really fiddly, right? We've written batch files and things like that to help automate and keep everything straight. And I really reached a point where the batch files just weren't cutting it for me anymore. And so I was looking for a nice cross-platform way to automate some of these tasks. And I thought, well, everybody has Unity, and Unity is cross-platform. Should be able to get that to make a cross-platform tool set for automating many of the tasks that I'm looking at. So I'm going to be doing this in three parts. First, just some basic automation, getting TensorFlow started and getting general config stuff and whatnot going. The second part, which is going to be a separate video, is going to be interpolating settings so that you can experiment and run large batch experiments overnight or during a weekend or something like that without having to set each one up or having to get into some crazy batch file guru magic. Then the third thing we're going to get into is by hooking into TensorBoard and being able to get feedback about the training progress and how the training is going, actually using that to perform evolutionary training, which has provided me with some very excellent results. So those are the three parts. This one, we're going to start with just the basics of, what are the things that this automates and how do you get it up and running. So the first thing is, this is a separate project from the other projects that I've normally had. So you can come to my GitHub and you'll see we have ML Simple Scenario, which some people have. And then this is the Unity ML Training Manager. So this is the Training Manager project. This project isn't designed to be built into an executable. We're actually running this in the Unity editor, and it will just handle many of the tasks that I would manually be doing. Right, so there's a main camera and directional light that aren't doing anything. Then there's this training manager. This has the configuration, right? Where is the root directory for the ML agent stuff, right? On my machine, it's on the E drive, and it's at this ML agent 03/Python, right? Where are the TensorBoard summaries? Because you need that as a parameter to TensorBoard. Where are the models stored? Where is Unity putting its output for the projects, for the environments that you're creating? And so in this one, I have a drive letter, while I don't for the others. And then also, where do the config files go? And that one also has a drive letter. So the precise configuration of whether or not you need a drive letter or not is going to be a little dependent on your setup, and where does everything go, and what all the paths should be is going to be on your setup. Shouldn't be too far from that. And then from there, we have this event services, which basically just says, when application start, what do we do? And the first thing it does is it checks to see if TensorBoard is running. If TensorBoard isn't running, it will actually start TensorBoard. So it will use the parameters in here, and it will start up TensorBoard, and it will start it and point it at the summaries folder that you defined, right? And then you can pop open a browser. There's also this TensorBoard startup time, so it'll start it up and then check and see if it's running, start it up again. Depends on if I've run it before or not. First time I start up my computer and run TensorBoard, it takes a bit longer than 10 seconds for TensorBoard to start up. So sometimes it'll start at 2 instances. So I'm going to bump that TensorBoard startup time to 20 seconds. It doesn't hurt anything if it starts 2 TensorBoards. You just close one of them and it's no big deal. And then also, yes, where is the TensorFlow config? And that's just a reference over to this TensorFlow config. And I clearly have a spelling issue in that. When TensorBoard is not running, it will, again, run the check TensorBoard again. If TensorBoard is running, then it logs something in the log file and then starts to execute training. So here in the Run Manager, this is what executes the training. So you'll see that this is the name of our run set. So that's going to be in the run ID, right? So I'm just calling this basic training. And then how many seconds to pause before you run. So, so I ran into an issue where because I was running the training scenarios so fast, that one hadn't fully closed out all of the device stuff before the next one started. So just like a 2-second pause in there, make sure that everything shuts down, and then you can start it back up and you're good to go. The Unity output file name, starting config increments, max config increments, we're going to get into that in the next video. And then the runs per configuration. So one of the things that you often want to do is really characterize what a particular configuration or program is doing. And so in this case, you'll want to run it multiple times so that you can get a good feel for what's going on. So I have it set up to run 5 times per configuration, and we only have one configuration. Again, where's the TensorFlow config? And where is the tensor board manager? Those are all just references elsewhere. And then are we loading from a saved model? No, we're not. Again, we'll get into that for other reasons. The run stats, this is actually kind of an output. So as runs complete, you'll see the name of the run and the average reward, the final reward. And so that will all be in the run stats. On next increment, and this is figuring out, again, we'll get into that when we start talking about exploring hyperparameter space, but that's basically just how do you move through a loop. And then on start increment, again, this is going into dynamic config files and saving it off. And then when all increments are complete, what do you need to do from there? And so in this case, it just logs and says, hey, all runs are complete. So one of the big things that this solved for me was managing my config files. I had a big problem where, I had one run and I had a config file for that, and then I wanted to do another run and I had a separate config file, and then I would accidentally overwrite things, and nothing was really siloed or well labeled because I was doing it all manually. And so sooner or later, you're just going to make a mistake. So this actually takes care of that config files for you. So in your run manager, it's going to have, in this case, I'm calling it basic training, and it's going to give it a configuration increment number and a run number. And so those 3 parts together, the base name, increment, and config, all provide enough information so we have a unique identifier, and so it will save out a config file for that particular run so that now you have a full history, and your summary will show full history, but you can always go back and say, oh man, what were my settings at this particular point in time for this run because it did super awesome? We got it, right? So it's doing all of that automatically for you. And then so this configuration manager also provides a unified mechanism to not only deal with the YAML file that is used by the Python library. Sorry, still got a little cough. Right? And so you can come in here and you can override things and, change them up. It also has a very similar config for your application, so that if you want to pass parameters into your application over time, you want to try different configurations and want to explore how having a different number of layers might affect training performance, because we've seen before that may actually happen, right? You can actually use the exact same interface and exact same mechanism to change those settings. And again, it will keep a properly named history of all of those configurations so that you don't lose track of which run had which config file and what you needed to do with it, because the automation tool is very good at saving all of that out in a way that is useful. So I'm very happy with this tool. I've been using it for a little bit, and I've gotten some really good results with it. So we're just going to start a simple run to show you what this is about. So I'm going to go in the config manager, and I'm going to look at the max steps. 50,000 is too much for a video, so I'm going to say 5,000 steps for each. So it's going to be super short training, but that's fine. And then the rest of these settings should be fine. Hidden units, yes, 128. So it will write out a training config.yaml file, and it'll have that default section that has the default provided by Unity. And then anytime you check any of these in your brain segment, right? Whereas in this case, it's still called basic brain 6. That will override. It'll provide those override values. What's nice about that is if you just want to use the default, you can just uncheck it as opposed to deleting it and then wondering, oh man, what was that, by default, or what did I use before? So, having that checkbox just makes it so super simple to say, oh yeah, I do want to override this. All right, so we're going to hit run and we're going to watch this thing in action. And I'm going to go ahead and clear that. So when I hit run, the first thing it's going to do is it's going to fire up TensorBoard. So it's going to check. This says TensorBoard is off, starting TensorBoard and waiting a few seconds for startup. And TensorBoard is up. You can tell that this is not the first time that my computer has run TensorBoard since I restarted earlier. But it's going to go ahead and wait that 15 seconds or so as it wants to make sure that TensorBoard is fully up and running. And you'll see that it is. Oh, and now you see this pi.exe. So it has waited long enough and it has started training. And there's a tiny little window again. You can't really see it because my video feed, my webcam feed is over it, but my training environment has started up. But you can see here that this has begun. So you can see basic training increment 1 run 0, right? And so we're outputting text, looks like every 1,000 steps or so. There we go. And I did clean out the TensorBoard summary so that we got a nice clean screen here. And so now we are off and running, right? So 1, 2, 3, 4,000. And then once we hit 5,000, there we go. It is going to save everything and it's going to move on to the next iteration. So now we are increment 1, run 1. So this part is 0 indexed. And you can see here's our cumulative reward for those 5,000 iterations. So let's go to my directory, agent 03, Python. And so you will see in here, I called it basic training, right? And here's basic training increment 1. So this is the configuration that is used for basic training increment 1. Again, that's the only configuration increment we have. But you can see in here, this is the number of layers parameter that I'm giving to my environment because I parameterized that a while back. In the meantime, I've just made it JSON instead of just straight up text. And now we have a way that we can parametrically define that as opposed to having to go into that myself. And then we'll also see this basic training increment 1.yaml. So again, we go into here and we can see here is all of the default settings, and then here's the basic brain 6 that says, okay, bump up the hidden units and bump up the number of max steps. So again, all of that is saved, and it has consistent naming with what's in TensorBoard, which means it has consistent naming with what is in the summaries, and it has consistent naming with what is in the models. So everything is named very, very consistently, which is great, aside from getting tired of me saying the word consistently over and over again. It is great because it's easy to find things. Also, for your trainer config.yaml, it will, if there's one already there, which there frequently is, it'll just make a backup, and you'll end up with a whole bunch of YAML backups. And that was just a safety measure, just in case you had something custom and then you started the program and it ran the risk of overwriting something. So I always back up whatever's there, but then I also write out a specific YAML with a naming convention so that you know that at this configuration, right? So we're doing 5 runs of one configuration. So this is that configuration for those 5 runs in both the JSON and the YAML. So we're almost trained up here. Right, so run 0, run 1, 2, 3. And then if we go back to Unity, what we'll see if we go to the run manager again is this is interfacing, oh, there, the 5th one kicked off. This is interfacing with TensorBoard on the back end. So we can see, again, same run ID, consistent naming convention, what run number is it, which increment number is it, final reward, average reward. And so this is what really makes it powerful, because now we have hooks into the system we can start up the whole system, we can execute a run, and we can assess those runs. So that means that we can then start taking other actions automatically. We can adjust the configuration at runtime, right? And then it will, so we can read those values, take an action, maybe change the configuration, and then do another execution and do something, right? So this is like the very basics of getting things automated, and I think it's really the gateway to having some very powerful automated training tools and automated testing tools that you can use to explore hyperparameter space and try new mechanisms for training without having to do all of that manually. So I will say this is all done on a PC. If you are Linux or Mac, I am very curious to see if this works for you, because I haven't tried using Unity to kick off processes, command console processes on those other platforms. If it doesn't work, I'd happily work with people to integrate kind of a Mac extension or Linux extension so that we can take the exact same code base and just, it's probably just how the console commands are executed is going to be a little different. And so we just have a little adjustment for whatever platform you're on, but then all of this config stuff should be completely reusable between systems. And you can see all of our runs are complete. Everything seems to be happy. I'm going to go ahead and refresh TensorBoard here. Right, so runs 0 through 4, and then here we go. We have 4 different training scenarios. So that is, in a nutshell, the automation of Unity machine learning training. If there is a feature in here that you really, really want, this is an open source MIT project, so you can add something and do a pull request, or you can send me code, or you can just tell me what it is and I'll see if I can integrate it. I'm very open to making this a community tool. It's just something that I started myself because I felt I had a need. I was getting frustrated with all those batch files, and so now they're all gone. So that's where we are. If you have any questions, comments, please, as always, put them in the comments below. Also, another huge shout out to my patrons at patreon.com who help make this show possible. I really appreciate your support in this regard. And I understand for a lot of people, they're not really ready or not in a financial place that they can support via Patreon. All I ask is that if you found something useful or helpful at all in this video, that you hit the like button or share it to some friends that might get some use out of it too. Thank you very much, and have a great time learning out there. Bye-bye.